Hi. The black and white keys on Osmose may make it look like a regular synth, but it doesn't sound or play like one at all. Regular synth keys just detect velocity, and then it's up to the synth to take things from there. Osmose continuously detects pressure, as well as left and right motion for pitch bends, and it has a built-in synth that can range from natural acoustic sounds to what you'd expect from a synth, all the way to wild textures you might not. I don't mean to sound hyperbolic, but Osmose is probably the biggest step forward in terms of expressive control a set of black and white keys give you since the invention of the piano compared to the harpsichord. It also has one of the most powerful and complex synth engines built into it, the Haken Audio EaganMatrix, though you can use Osmose to control any regular or MPE-based synth via MIDI. In this video, I'll take a look at the top pros and cons of Osmose, its hardware controls and many internal synth engines, using it with external MIDI gear, and an in-depth look into the EaganMatrix. A quick disclosure, Expressive E, the company who makes Osmose, sent it over for review and they're not getting it back. No money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with what is, in my opinion, the biggest innovation in this keybed, and that's that the black and white keys are pressure sensitive throughout the range of the key's motion, which means anything starting with a light touch can generate a sound, and as you increasingly apply more pressure, the sound's timbre can morph and evolve based on how it was programmed. What's more important is that pressure detection, as well as other expression controls, are all polyphonic. So not only do your fingers replace envelopes here, each key and finger can be doing its own thing, which adds even more to the human feel of playing this instrument. Beyond the halfway point, pressure has done its thing, and Aftertouch starts to kick in for another about centimeter of distance. So you've got quite a bit of control over that. And Aftertouch can take the patch in a different direction compared to just what pressure does. We're increasingly seeing other keybeds with Aftertouch and even sometimes polyphonic Aftertouch, but a common limitation on most other keybeds is that the Aftertouch travel distance is very shallow. Here, it's almost a centimeter. So all this distance on the white keys, it's a bit less on the black keys. So say from here and down, maybe 4 or 5 millimeters, but still you've got a good degree of control over it. Finally, Osmose has one more dimension of per key control built into the hardware, left and right motion for each key, can send pitch bend, up and down, as you move the key a few millimeters left and right. Now, while the main advantage Osmose has compared to other expressive or MPE style controllers is its black and white key layout, the disadvantage here is that multi-dimensional control isn't entirely free in every dimension. So first you need to apply 100% pressure before Aftertouch kicks in, and they're both in the same direction as opposed to X and Y controls or Y and Z controls on some other controllers. And while you can technically grab a key and apply pitch bend while it's in the pressure phase, you almost need to push it all the way down to be able to bend its pitch and apply a bit of Aftertouch or maximum Aftertouch to bend pitch. Certainly on the white keys, maybe a little less so on the black keys if you come in from the side. So pressure needs to be at about 100% to pull off pitch bends. So those are the physical innovations and controls in Osmose, but there are a few gestures these continuous controls enable with a bit of clever software. One of the more interesting ones is pressure glides. On most synths, glide is a set it and forget it matter. Here, you control the speed of the glide based on the relative pressure you apply between the original and destination note. You can have glide apply across the keyboard. In this case, the keybed becomes monophonic, or you could set narrower glide intervals. You do that in the playing menu, pressure glide, and go ahead to configure it, and then choose a narrower pressure glide interval. So you can play glides with notes that are up to a fifth apart. But beyond that, you can play polyphonically, and you can even play polyphonic glides if you plan your intervals correctly. A couple of things to be aware of, at least as of the current firmware: you need to release the original note before the glide makes it to its final destination. So you need to be careful if you play chords that have notes that are less than the pressure glide distance apart. If you do that, you'll get a note that's sometimes a microtonal distance between the two notes. Hopefully they'll add a feature that just looks at the pressure applied to the destination note, ignoring the pressure on the source note. Another gesture that's only possible with a long range of motion is detecting expression relative to where you're at in the key's range. For example, in this patch, it feels as if I'm scraping my finger across a rough surface just by moving the key up and down. This patch is another example of a virtual pluck point planted in the travel of the key that works in both directions, going up and down. Another example for an algorithmic use of this distance: this patch strums 3 notes. As I play the key, if I play it slower, it'll strum them slower, and of course, if I play it fast, I'll get rapid strums. Another interesting algorithmic use of this keybed is the arpeggiator in here. Unlike most ARPs, which play all the notes identically, here each note's timbre and potentially pitch bend will change dynamically based on how you play each key. And Osmose takes this even further. Aside from the usual suspect arpeggiator features, you can assign 2 per key sources to impact arpeggiator parameters. So for example, let's take pressure and apply it to, let's say, ratchets. So very light pressure, we'll play just 1 ratchet, and I can add ratchets for 1 note by applying more pressure, and you can change the curve to adjust this to any way you like. Another interesting destination is octave. So not applying pressure won't transpose the octaves played, but applying more pressure on a per note basis lets me apply octave transpositions to that note. This arpeggiator, by the way, currently only works with the internal synth engine, but I'm told that it's planned as a future firmware update for controlling external synths. So that's an overview of the physical aspects of Osmose, but equally important to what makes it sound special is its internal synth engine, the Haken Audio EaganMatrix. This is the same digital synth engine as in Haken's Continuums, with many of its presets brought over and optimized for Osmose. What makes the EaganMatrix special isn't that it has multiple forms of synthesis, including subtractive, FM, ring mod, physical modeling, additive, and even limited granular, but rather that its matrix-based patching layout isn't just limited to patching a source to a destination. Each virtual cable can actually be an entire multivariable formula that takes into consideration multiple expression parameters, as well as a whole bunch of other things we'll talk about later. The synth supports up to 24 voices, and you can create layers and splits using the companion software, though you don't need to play those layers or splits or any of the presets with a computer or the software connected. The EaganMatrix is quite complex to program. Luckily, each patch comes with 6 macros to help you adjust its timbre. These aren't set parameters, rather They change on a per patch basis based on how they were programmed by the person that designed the patch. So those are the things that make Osmose special. Let's take an overall look at it and then dive deeper into the synth engines and the matrix. Osmose comes with over 500 factory presets, so there's quite a few to play with and they're quite diverse. And then you can store another 128 user presets on it. I'll be referencing the Haken Editor software later, but you don't need it or a computer connected to Osmose to play its internal sounds. Osmose can also play nice with other MIDI instruments, so you can ignore its internal sound engine if you want. It can also speak regular classic MIDI. It has a polyphonic Aftertouch mode and full MPE support, of course, as well. In terms of build, probably the most important thing is the keys. I think they feel excellent, somewhere between semi-weighted action and fully weighted. There is an aspect to them that feels a bit odd initially if you're coming from a regular keyboard. There's no hard stop like other keybeds. There's sort of this little bounce, a bit like walking in sand, something you might notice if you're coming from a hard surface. But I just got used to it after a few minutes. It has a metal top and a plastic enclosure. It feels solid overall, except maybe for the sides that are a little bit too sharp for my taste. The screen is a high-resolution LCD with good viewing angles, but it's not OLED, so it does fade out a bit if you're looking at it from the side, which you probably will be most of the time. The encoders are okay, but I've seen more premium ones. The screen is a bit laggy, so it's kind of hard to select parameters from lists, and there are no detents on the bottom encoders, probably because they're most useful when you're editing macro parameters. The side encoders do have detents, but even there's a bit of lag, which hopefully they'll be able to improve upon in future firmware update. The encoders are push encoders. Sometimes you'll use them to select from lists. The pitch and mod controllers are faders instead of wheels like on most synths, but they work the same way. Pitch is a bouncy controller, and you can use it to perform monophonic pitch glides. Other controllers on the panel are a master volume, then these buttons above the screen select the different menus. The M button is how you choose between controlling the internal sound engine and external MIDI devices. There's a global settings menu here. Then the buttons on the bottom let you move between presets immediately. And you need to be in the tab of the preset you last selected. And then you can use these buttons to move back and forth between presets. And as you can hear, audio is cut out as you move between presets. And then these buttons transpose octaves. In terms of connectivity, Osmose has a headphone jack up front where it's supposed to be, with a retractable level control knob, which is a nice touch. And on the back, it has two pseudo-balanced outputs. That means they're not fully balanced, but they did do the job here when using balanced cables in terms of preventing ground loops and computer noise, which I usually have in my setup when I've got a computer hooked up via USB. Beside that, it comes with a wall wart and a little plug that you need to screw in. Make sure you do that so it doesn't fall out. Two expression pedal inputs, which you can assign to numerous destinations. USB for MIDI in and out and control of the Haken software, and 5-pin MIDI DIN in and outs. In terms of the screen and controls, like I mentioned, you've got two main modes, either sound engine mode or external MIDI mode. In each of these modes, you've got 4 main menus, and then these two encoders move you left and right within tabs within the menus. So these are the tabs in the presets menu, these are the tabs in the synth menu. And if you can control more parameters than you can see on screen, and you'll see that with the dots here on the bottom, then you use this encoder to scroll through the different items you can control. Let's go through these menus briefly. For preset selection, you choose either the factory or user tabs, and then either scroll through the list and press to select, or use the preset buttons. And rather than scrolling through all the patches, you can choose a patch type and character, and that will narrow down the list over here. In the case of this character and type, we only have one option, but let's choose a different one. And yeah, there are a few here. Selecting the presets with the encoder is a bit tricky because of the lag, but once you've selected one, then you can move through the patches with the preset buttons. If you do have a computer and the Haken Editor connected, then if you click the System Library button, you've got a few more categories that you can choose from here to narrow down patches, and you can disable selections using this. Look through all the presets quickly here and search through patches as well. So as you type, you'll see a selection of patches you can choose. Without getting into the details of the editor, you can save presets to disk or open presets from the hard drive, and user presets here are organized in groups of 8 patches per group, 8 groups or banks in total, and you can save and load groups with one click. So that's the presets menu. If we go to the synth menu, there are a few tabs here. The macros tab will have 6 macros, which will be different on a per preset basis. So in this case, it's pitch and mix and slap and ring and body, aftertouch rate. So these are different per preset. And then if we shift one tab to the right, the global effects are identical for all the patches. You'll see me referring to the global effects as the recirculator. It's basically either a set of reverbs or delays, which I think sound pretty nice. There are additional parameters here. Extend doubles the delay and reverb time and works at a lower sample rate. Decay can get pretty long. Anyway, reverb is just one option. Here we go. Then there are a few delays. You have to be careful here because feedback can get pretty loud depending on which delay you choose. Yeah, it's a ping pong. Anyway, very nice reverb and digital and analog style delays here. Then continuing in the synth tab, you've got a global EQ. Pretty straightforward with a mix control. So kind of like a high pass filter here. Pretty aggressive EQ. And then a compressor, global one knob compressor with pre and post gain. And then voice controls, currently the configuration of the pitch bend wheel. And then the last tab in the synth menu is the mod/pedal assign tab. This lets you assign destinations to the 2 pedals you can plug in the back, as well as the mod fader. Both pedal inputs support continuous expression input or on-off switches with a number of destinations, including macros and effect parameters. One of my favorite features here is the way sustain and sostenuto are implemented. I'll go to pedal 2, which I can control with the mod wheel as well. So let's maybe choose first sustain here. Here we go. So if I had a pedal connected here, it would work like this fader and basically in sustain mode. Sustain notes as long as this is above 0 with level control. And sustain would stop once I lift my foot. Sostenuto works a bit differently. It lets me drone a few notes, and then notes that I play beyond the ones that I captured won't be added to the sustained notes. And I could keep controlling the level of sostenuto until I turned it off. And this actually supports 2 sostenuto groups if you want. Anyway, that's the synth menu. The next menu is the sensitivity menu. The first tab lets you control the extent of pitch bend. And it can get pretty extreme. Let's maybe choose a more sane range. You can also disable pitch bend entirely. So if you play chords with Aftertouch, it gets a bit hard not to bend pitch in one of the keys. So if you do that a lot, you can just disable pitch bends. And that won't be an issue. You can also try and address this with the sensitivity options. So control the curves, and same applies for pressure and for Aftertouch. You've got curve controls, a few presets, and a custom option as well. So you could set the sensitivity for note on events, for example, so that it would require more than just a light touch to trigger a note. If you want to freeze these settings as you swap presets, just hit the freeze button. And the last menu is the playing menu, which we already talked about. This has both the arpeggiator and pressure glide or pressure weighted portamento. Before we dive into the Haken Editor and the EaganMatrix, let's briefly look at controlling external MIDI gear. You'll be presented with a few general mode options. So classic keyboard is just for controlling a regular synth or software instrument where everything happens on one single channel. If you move into poly Aftertouch mode for synths that support it, you'll have polyphonic control over Aftertouch again on the same channel. And the holy grail of polyphonic expression is obviously MPE, where you have control over pressure separately and Aftertouch, as well as pitch bends. If your synth doesn't support MPE, then you can still use the multi-channel option. If you can configure multiple channels to play the same instrument or different instruments, then this can send out every note on a different channel without sending the master channel information, which will be used on synths that support MPE. Beside that, you can configure how pressure and Aftertouch behave, meaning what they're assigned to, what destination they're assigned to, and the range that they send out. And then the sensitivity menu lets you control how the key bed responds to touch. This includes the pitch bend, range, and sensitivity, as well as velocity. You've got a few settings for that, and you can create your own custom settings as well. The playing menu is currently empty. Hopefully, at the very least, we'll get an arpeggiator like we do on the sound engine side. MIDI gets sent out to the MIDI port, and if you're using USB, make sure to listen only to Osmose port 1, because port 2 might be sending out the sound engine MIDI controls, which can really mess things up on your synth. Okay, once you've got everything hooked up, a few tips and thoughts about working with external MIDI synths, whether it's hardware or software. Tip number 1, consider disabling velocity detection on your synth and reprogramming your patches a little bit to compensate for that. Let me explain. Since initial velocity and pressure are essentially the same range of motion in Osmose, if you want a gradual response to the entire pressure range, meaning you'll be introducing pressure slowly, your synth will always think you're playing all your notes really quietly. So tip number 1 is to rethink how you build patches, and if you've got a factory patch, think about changing it a bit so that it doesn't respond to velocity. Then tip number 2 is how to compensate for that. You can point channel pressure to multiple destinations. So for example, here I've got it pointed to the suborbit speed. But if I go into the settings, you'll see I've also got it pointed to the patch volume. If you don't have patch volume as a destination, look for sustain as a destination. So here I've got channel pressure pointed to volume, but also pointed to suborbit speed. Because Vector Synth supports MPE, then pressure modulation will work individually for each note I press. Tip number 3 is to be mindful what parameter range on your synth the full range of motion on Osmose impacts. Depending on your synth, you might be able to define that again in the synth settings. So there's multiple ranges here. For example, for brightness, I chose this range. Basically the mod depth and the initial offset. If for some reason your synth can't do this, then you can change the parameter ranges on Osmose. Tip number 4 is to remember that Aftertouch only kicks in when pressure is at 100%. So you'll lose whatever control you have over the pressure parameter when you want to start changing the Aftertouch parameter. So here in Vector, I've got pressure controlling the orbit speed and Aftertouch controlling orbit size, which is complementary to a continued motion of the suborbit speed. Tip number 5 is to be mindful of how pitch bends are configured. So first thing, not all synths, and I think Vector doesn't, move to a pitch bend range of 48 or 96 when you enable MP. So make sure you change that so that you can get the full extent of pitch bend if you want it, of course. And then final tip number 6 for syncing with external MIDI gear. When you play chords in Osmose, Pitch bends can really mess things up and aren't really very useful. Now you can of course disable pitch bends, but then you lose a dimension of control. So for Expressive E, it would be nice if we could map pitch bends like we can pressure and Aftertouch to MIDI CCs to control various aspects of your synth. And specifically with Vector, this is pretty cool. You can actually disconnect pitch bend from controlling pitch and say connect it to controlling a different parameter. Let's get it back going over here. So now I've got pitch bend controlling filter cutoff here as opposed to pitch. So I could say close down a whole chord or make it brighter by moving my hands left and right. Anyway, if your synth has this feature, it's great, but it would be nice if Osmose supported this too, built in this menu. Okay, let's take a look at the Haken Editor. Even if you never plan to create your own presets, it's worthwhile to familiarize yourself with it because there are a few things that you can, at least as of the current firmware, only do from here. For example, import and backup presets like I showed you earlier and create splits and layers. Let's start with a quick tour. There's scaling here. If you've got a high-res screen, you can turn surface visualization on or off. This area is modeled after the continuum, but you can pretty easily tell the black and white keys apart. As you apply more pressure to a note, you'll see a circle around its location grow. That's the Z-axis. And as you get into the Aftertouch region, called the Y-axis, you'll first see an arrow pointing down, slowly fade into an arrow pointing up. So that's pressure and Aftertouch. And with pitch bends, you'll see this circle roll through the pitch bend range. Anyway, this area is useful mainly to set the split location and turn on splits. We'll get to that in a second. Then you've got DSP usage here and settings over here, MIDI and global settings. You want to be connected to port 2 and you'll see these blinking LEDs. That's a good thing. And you can use this to route additional external devices through your computer. This plays completely differently when you have a regular keyboard connected to it. The next row shows you 8 groups of presets. If you make changes to the current preset and want to save those changes, just hit Shift and click over here. You can also drag presets from your hard drive onto any one of these slots. The next row shows you 6 selectable panels. If you use these radio buttons over here, macros, and recirculator effects, you've got access to these using the Osmose interface. The other tabs have parameters you can't access from Osmose, for example, the convolution settings and graphs that may be used in certain presets. Then when you dive into the EaganMatrix, some of the modules have additional parameters that you can control using additional controls here. And then the next area that could be useful for you is the System Library tab on the bottom here. I showed you this earlier to select presets or to search for them. Let's move on and talk about splits and layers. Like I mentioned earlier, that's something you can only do with the Haken Editor currently. Luckily, that's pretty easy to do, and you don't need the editor to use a split or layer once you've saved it. You can create either a single keyboard split, layer 2 presets, or layer 3 presets. To set this up, you need to make sure that the presets you want to split or layer are next to each other in a single group. So let's say that I wanted to create a split where Creaker is on one half of the keyboard and Crystal Harmonics is on the other half. Then you select the first one, and then if you want the first preset to be below the split point, you choose this one. And if you want it the other way around, you choose this option. And now we've got Creaker over here and Crystal Harmonics over here. And you can move the split point around using this control. Now don't forget to save this, hold Shift and click here. A little dot will appear showing you saved a split. Other options are a layer, in this case of 2 presets, Creaker and Crystal Harmonics. And if you want to create a 3 preset layer, we've got Dabka over here. Let's go back into here, choose this option. And now all 3 are layered. And to save this, hit Shift and press here, and you'll see 2 dots, meaning that this and the next 2 patches are connected. So that's how you create splits and layers. Obviously, it would be nice if you could do that through the controls, and if you could also transpose each of the layers and splits individually and determine which preset is controlled by the macros. A word of caution, this is not an officially supported feature as of this firmware, and I did have Osmose crash on me once when setting this up. Okay, let's dive into programming the EaganMatrix. So the good news is that you're facing one of the most powerful synths I've ever seen in software or in hardware. The bad news is that programming this matrix is very much the total opposite of using a physical synth panel. The EaganMatrix is a totally modular synth, meaning it's not going to make any sounds or let you control or modulate anything unless you start making connections in the matrix. And the good or bad news, depending on your point of view, is that each connection can be a multivariable formula. So don't expect to just plug a pin or cable in and be done with. Similar to other matrix-based synths, you've got sources on the left and destinations on top. The rows are like splitters, so you can take a single source and connect it to multiple destinations. And the columns are like mixers, so they can combine multiple values and multiple audio or control sources into one. The 4 rows on the bottom are a bit different in that respect. They don't have designated sources. We'll talk about them in a bit. So let's start with an empty patch and see how to get this going. To make a connection, you need to plug in a non-zero value from one of the sources to one of the destinations. Noise is probably the simplest source, and the left and right inputs of the master are the quickest destinations to get a sound out of this. It's always a good idea to lower the synth's volume before you start patching. The first way to make a connection is by simply typing in a number, and if I type in 1, which is unity gain or multiply the source by 1, we've got noise going into our left ear and into our right ear, and we've created our first stereophonic noise patch. Delete, by the way, will delete a node. You can type in numbers that are smaller than 1, so say 0.01 won't make a lot of noise, and you can use the arrow keys to increase and decrease the numbers. The next thing you can type into nodes are the letters X, Y, and Z, which represent physical dimensions on the keybed. Z is pressure, right? So from nothing to halfway down. Y is aftertouch, from halfway down to all the way down. And X is pitch, including pitch bends. So if I plugged Z from noise to left, then we won't hear anything. But the minute I apply pressure, we will gradually hear noise. And I'll go into here and turn off the reverb just so we get a clean sound. And I could say type in Y into this node, so we'll hear noise on the right side once we pass the 100% pressure point and get into aftertouch. We'll use X for pitch in a bit, and then the third type of object we can place in the matrix is a formula. We've got formulas A through V. We'll get to that in a bit. Before that, let's get acquainted with the sources and destinations in the matrix. This can get pretty complex. Luckily, if you forget what something does, the little dots here will give you tooltips. Here we go. As to what each destination is. And typically, but not always, audio inputs have little arrows next to them, but it's not always the case. For example, these don't. Anyway, from left to right, you've got the master module with its recirculator or delay and reverb global effects. There's a convolution before the recirculator and after it, a submix, and dry left and right inputs if you want to use them, if you don't want to go through the global effects. Then you've got 5 identical slots that can house one of several simple modules. These are either one of a few oscillators, filters, a ring mod, and a noise generator. So these are identical, and you can have any mix of filters and oscillators you like. Then you've got 3 bigger, more complex module slots. The first two can host any one of a number of complex modules, including 48 filter banks, sine oscillator banks, and various harmonic, additive, and kinetic models. Like I mentioned earlier, some of these have additional parameters that are accessible here. And then slot C has a few interesting delay module options. The difference between this delay and the master recirculator, which you can control here as well, is that this delay is per voice. So you can use this for physical modeling or for other per voice delay based effects. Then finally, the last 5 slots are for identical shape generators. These can be either envelope generators or LFOs, whether they cycle once or continuously. They have a dual envelope option just in case you want 10 envelopes in your patch. And I think you can use this as an envelope follower as well. So those are our matrix destinations. on the left are matrix sources. We already heard noise. You've got outputs for the 5 simple modules over here. This is where you pick up the audio coming out of these and send them to where you want. Then you've got the mono outputs for each of the 3 banks. Then you've got 2 pairs of stereo sources. Osmose doesn't have a stereo input, unlike the Continuum, but you can use this to pick up stereo delay taps from the delay module, and you can use the other pair to pick up additional taps or audio from the master submix. So up until now on the left, we've seen audio sources, though they can be used as audio rate mod sources too. And then the bottom 4 rows are a bit different. Since there are so many potential non-audio mod sources in the EaganMatrix, theoretically you'd need a row for each formula, a row for each of the shape generators, a row for each of the 6 macros, and so on. Since we don't want a matrix that's multiple pages long, you can simply type in numbers, XYZ letters, or formula letters directly in these 4 rows. Anything in the first 2 rows will be added and summed up, sent up top. In this row, it will be subtracted, and anything in the bottom row will multiply everything on top of it. So let's delete these 2 and start making a more complex patch. The easiest way to control an oscillator with pitch is to plug in the X parameter to control its frequency. So that's oscillator 1, and let's hear the output of oscillator 1 in stereo using pressure. So we now have a simple sine wave that we can play polyphonically, and we can apply pitch bends to. And of course, we control its level using pressure. A nice perk is that this also works with pressure-weighted portamento for the interval we set. I'm obviously not going to go through all the different modules here, but say if I go into the phase generator, we can get a few more virtual analog style wave shapes. Let's go back to a sine wave to keep things simple. Now, a quick way to get Aftertouch going in this patch is to plug in Y into the spectral balance. Here we go, of this module. So just hit Y into here. And now as I go beyond the maximum pressure point and apply Aftertouch, the wave shape will change. Let's explore something a bit more complex. For example, FM. We'll get oscillator 2 into the picture. Let's plug pitch into it as well. And now let's plug in the output of oscillator 2 to the frequency of oscillator 1. And let's do that using Aftertouch, using Y. So now as we apply Aftertouch, we'll get really nice audio rate frequency modulation of the pitch of oscillator 1. Now remember I said we can use this row to multiply anything above it. Let's say plug in the number 1 into here and increase the frequency, double the frequency of oscillator 2. Notice we'll get higher harmonics now. If I type in 0.5, we'll get lower harmonics. If I wanted to apply a filter to this, by the way, then I could plug the output of oscillator 1 into a filter, delete these, and then plug the output of the filter into the master. So this circular style of patching is how you create long module chains. So you can get pretty far without using formulas, but things get more interesting when you do. So for example, what if I didn't want to control this with arrow keys, but rather I wanted to control the frequency ratio with a macro? We'd need a formula for that. Now, formulas can be quite intimidating at first because they are, and they have multiple variables. But the nice thing is, while you can use multiple parameters, you don't need to get a lot done. So let's get this back to 0 and this as well. So the first thing that seems pretty obvious is that a formula can take into consideration X, Y, and Z, but the W section is where we can start involving shape generators or macros. W stands for window, but it's really just a catch-all for a few different potential mod sources, which are revealed when you press this little dot. All these dots, by the way, are items you can press and choose from. Anyway, the options here are either a constant, which is just a value that you set here, a gate, which is an on-off value the minute you touch a key, one of the 5 shape generators, or 10 if you're using dual envelope mode, and a few complex things we won't get into now. Anyway, for now, let's go for constant. And then in the little menu here, we can pick up one of the macros. Let's go for macro 1. So our formula is actually done. You'll notice it's disabled here because I didn't plug it into the matrix yet. I can click this node, type in A, and now it's active in the matrix. The thing is, if we go to our macros tab in the editor or to the macros over here, you'll see we don't have any macros yet. And that's because unfortunately you need to add them as a string into this sort of patch string. This, by the way, lets you set the patch category from a number of categories in here. Anyway, to add a macro, you simply go in here, type the Roman numeral of the macro you want to add, type in equal, and then type in the name of the macro, which is ratio in this case. And then if I hit done, it'll magically appear here and in the macro section over here. So now I can use this to control the ratio and fine-tune my Osmose FM wub to get it just right. Now you may have noticed cool icons for the macros here. The way to add those is to go into here and then press underscore and type the name of the macro icon, hit done, and now we've got a cool icon. As of the making of this video, I didn't get a list of which strings represent which icons, but let's save this patch. If you navigate around the presets and see an icon you like, just look for its string down here and copy it into your patch. Let's level up this patch a bit more by using an LFO or envelope. I'll choose Formula B for that. Now, to get a shape generator going, you need to set a frequency for it and you need to trigger it. So I'll choose a frequency of, say, 5 Hertz for shape generator 1, and I'll just put 1 or W here. Let's go for W to trigger it every time we press a key. Now, to actually use it in a formula, we go to our W slot and choose shape generator 1. It's an LFO. This is a ramp LFO. I can pick any one of the shapes here. Let's go for triangle LFO. And we need to multiply it by something that isn't 0. So let's do that. Now, how do we create a tremolo with this? If I was just to plug it into here, then our note would constantly play based on the LFO value. What I really want is to have a tremolo or LFO controlling my level, but also to have that be dependent on pressure, on the Z dimension. Now, the default formula will add the LFO value to the Z value, which is not what I want. What I want is for them to be multiplied. For that, I need to click the little equals button and choose a multiplication option. So if I didn't lose you, we can now take B and plug that instead of Z. And we now have a tremolo running at 5 Hertz. So those are the important things you need to know about the left side of the formula. As we go through these, you can choose different ranges for different curves, just like you can in the interface over here. Let's go back to a full range. And then further to the right are a few more items and widgets that help us control our formulas. Interpolation is kind of like a slew limiter. So if you want to slow down changes in parameters, you'll increase this. Persistence is kind of like a release. So as values go to 0, this will slow them down. You can use this for, say, to take a trigger envelope and create a release envelope. Then ancillary has a whole bunch of other options that you can use to multiply with your formula. Say, for example, if you want to take another formula and multiply it by this formula. If formulas are connected, then a little light will light up next to both of them. And then finally, blend is a cool option. If you turn blend on using this menu and say I'll set it to be controlled by macro number 2, then you get basically 2 versions of this formula, and you can morph between those 2 versions using macro 2 in this case. So this is primary, and this, say, let's do something crazy here, will be secondary, right? These 2 options, and we can morph between them based on this curve and the value of macro 2. Before we leave the matrix, a few quick tips if you want to try and figure out what's going on with some of the factory presets. So the first thing you may notice is that there are quite a few formulas in these. The reason there are so many, well, first because the patches are pretty complex and interesting, but mainly because we need pretty much at least one formula for every macro. And you can see which macros the formulas use over here. This is also good shorthand to see which dimensions are used by each formula, and if you see a number, it means that a shape generator is being used. Then there's a show function here, which is pretty useful. It shows you the values of formulas. So this is a nice way to investigate what's going on with a particular formula or node. The next tip is to just poke around interface elements because you never know what's hiding under them. For example, you can use graphs to control these parameters, and occasionally this Q here will let you quantize X values. So quite a bit to explore here, that's for sure. Then final matrix tip, go here and download Richard Cram's preset cookbook. This covers over 100 different patches and walks you through what's going on in them. And there are plenty of video tutorials on Richard's channel called EaganMatrix Programming. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons of Osmose. On the pros side, first and foremost is obviously what this means for people who feel comfortable playing black and white key-based controllers. Just the degree of expressive control you have over each sound from the moment you press a note including pitch bends. So hopefully you get a bit of the idea, and I don't think it's something that's possible to fully comprehend until you've actually played it. This keybed, along with a well-crafted synth patch, gives you natural and organic control of what you're playing in a way that, in my opinion, is truly a revolutionary step forward for this form factor. Now, it's not that you can't get expressive with regular black and white keyboards. I don't think the difference is as noticeable if you're playing in certain styles, for example, fast leads or bass lines. On the contrary, you might want uniform sounds then, and you have a regular MIDI mode here for that. But if you're playing any sound that would benefit from human, organic, continuous control, this is as good as it gets while still sticking to the familiar black and white key form factor. Then the second major pro for Osmose is the powerful Haken Audio EaganMatrix based synth engine, and in particular, its excellently crafted presets. Yes, it's got a long feature list and plenty of synthesis types, including virtual analog, FM, physical modeling, additive, but a patch designer needs to know what to do with all that, and the team behind the engine and presets here certainly do. The EaganMatrix has a very broad range from natural-sounding acoustic, bowed, and percussive instruments through regular and otherworldly synth patches, all the way to wild and totally out-of-control sound effects and textures. Many of its presets are kind of like their own instruments, which are a true treat to explore. The third main pro for Osmose, in my opinion, is its implementation of pressure-weighted portamento for targeted pitch bends, polyphonically as well. It's a feature that leverages the large degree of control you have here for a musically relevant result. Yes, it can be improved in a few ways, like I mentioned when I discussed this feature, but overall, I think it's a major differentiator and something you can't do anywhere else with black and white keys. And then the final pro for Osmose is the fact that it's also a MIDI and MPE compatible controller, so if you want to use it to control regular synths or interface with other hardware or software MPE synths, some of which are easier to program than the EaganMatrix, then you can. Then on the cons side, probably the biggest disadvantage is the learning curve and opposite of hands-on nature of the EaganMatrix. Its design is clearly for power and features and not for ease of use or legibility of existing presets. So all the modules it has are great, but I think patching a synth should also be fun and easy, and that's not the case here. Luckily, this sends out MPE, so if you're ever tired of the hundreds of presets in here, it's pretty easy to use other synths, for example, like Pigments from Arturia, which is pretty easy to program and also has quite a few synth engines. Then the second thing you need to be aware of when comparing this to other expressive controllers is that you're giving up a few degrees of motion to get these familiar black and white keys. Other expressive synths and controllers like the Continuum, Sensel Morph, and Linstrument let you move along the X, Y, and Z axes almost entirely independently of each other, which is not the case here. Here, Z for pressure and Y for Aftertouch go in the same direction, and you can't start controlling Aftertouch, or Y as it's called here, until Z is at 100%, and pressure stays at 100% when you're playing with Aftertouch until you completely release Aftertouch and you regain control of pressure. Same goes for the X-axis. Controllers like Continuum and Linstrument give you total freedom to glide the pitch of multiple notes in any direction to any destination you like. Here, pitch bends on each key are limited to set intervals, and you can't really play pitch bends without applying pressure to almost all the way down. Otherwise, your finger will just slip on the surface, or at least mine does, until you apply enough pressure. Also, it's hard to play chords with Aftertouch without causing an accidental pitch bend. Like I mentioned, you can disable pitch bends if you like, and certainly adjust their sensitivity. But overall, the more notes you hold and the harder you press them down, the more likely they are to slip a bit left and right. Then the third con is that the Synth engine currently doesn't support samples, granular, or additive synthesis using your own samples, but Haken Audio has actually hinted at those capabilities at Superbooth last year, so there's hope, but for now you can't load custom samples or re-synthesize your own audio into the additive synth engine here, which sounds totally awesome in the demo.
Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go and still have a feeling that you wanted to stay?
Finally, the fourth con here is that it feels like it's not 100% complete yet. Some features like splits and layers can only be activated using the Haken Editor, and the MIDI mode engine, the playing engine, is currently empty. But coming soon keeps us hopeful that we'll get a cool arpeggiator like we do on the synth side here. Also, the interface here feels a bit sluggish. It's really hard to select items from lists with the non-detent encoders. Hopefully this is something that can be fixed in a firmware update. Also, there are a few bugs here and there, and not that it crashes a lot, but throughout about a week of full-time testing, I got about 3 restarts. Every time, by the way, when the Haken Editor was connected and I was messing around with patches, so perhaps it's more stable without the editor connected. Hopefully those things can be tightened up with time. Then one little wishlist feature, I think it would be great if the X and Y or pitch bend motion could be assigned to other parameters than pitch bend. All that said though, I think whatever cons Osmose has, it shouldn't diminish from the amazing achievement that Expressive E and Haken Audio have pulled off here. A totally innovative, new and different synth keyboard bundled together with hundreds of presets that match these capabilities very well, along with quite a few new gestures that are only possible with these types of controls. So that's it for Osmose. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.
Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go and still have a feeling that you wanted to stay? Did you wanted to go and still have a Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go and still have a feeling that you wanted to stay?